Alright guys, we are starting a new portion of this unit. We're starting to talk about the brain. Studied the nervous system, the endocrine system, and neural communications and impulses, and now we're talking about the brain. So this is a really important unit. It's also really interesting. We're going to do a lot of hands-on activities with this, so let's get going on our notes. We're going to break this up into this section into two different videos. So, having our head examined, that's what we're going to talk about first. The oldest method of studying the brain involved observing the effects of brain diseases and injuries. So, I mean, somebody got in a car wreck and had a brain injury. Somebody, got hit in the head somehow and got hurt, and it's obvious that there was brain damage. That's the oldest and still used method of observing and, trying to get scientific data on the brain. It's just by simply watching people who have brain damage, observing their behavior, recording what they're doing. But powerful new techniques now reveal brain structures and activities in the living brain. So by surgically lesioning and electrically stimulating specific brain areas, by recording electrical activities on the brain's surface. Well, hold on, we're going to get to that. I'll give you this. A lesion is simply tissue destruction. It's where you cut into the brain. And sometimes it happens naturally, sometimes it happens experimentally. But an EEG, electroencephalogram, say that 3 times fast, is a recording of electrical activity on the brain's surface. And it's exactly what you see in this picture right here. This little girl is hooked up to an EEG, and they're, maybe showing her pictures or she's listening to some sort of music or sound or something like that, and they're recording her brain waves. And then the various ways to look inside the brain to see its activity, inside the living brain, I should say, to see its activity. You have the CT scan, the PET scan or a PET scan, the MRI, and the fMRI. And I'm going to click on these real quick so you can get these definitions. A CT scan is really an X-ray of your brain. This is also called a CAT scan if you've ever had one of these. They're pretty common when you get hit or any kind of blunt force trauma to the head. A CAT scan is pretty common. A PET scan is a visual display of brain activity that detects where a radioactive form of glucose goes while the brain performs a given task. So this is, they use PET scans often when they're trying to pinpoint a part of the brain that is malfunctioning. So maybe PET scans are very common with people who have seizures. So, maybe they're they'll give people PET scans and then they'll try to trigger a seizure to see, what part of the brain is activating and what's going on. An MRI, obviously you can have an MRI on any part of the body, any soft tissue part of the body. I'm sure some of y'all have probably had an MRI on maybe your knee or your arm or your foot or something like that. But an MRI, again, the brain is the soft tissue, so you can have an MRI of your brain. It uses magnetic fields and radio waves, and it produces computer-generated images. And this is a really neat tool because it shows brain anatomy. This is how we really see exactly how our brain looks on the inside without actually having to cut it out of somebody. And then an fMRI is a technique for revealing blood flow and then therefore brain activity. So fMRIs are very common, especially when somebody's had a brain injury, to make sure that blood is not being kept from certain parts of the brain, or if it is, how extensive is it. And they show brain function. So these are especially common with people who are brain dead. An fMRI is always going to show if somebody is in fact brain dead. An older brain structure, or older brain structures. These are kind of the foundation of our brains. The brainstem is the brain's oldest and innermost region, and it's responsible for automatic survival functions. So, like automatic survival functions, that is your heart beating, your lungs working, etc. And the brainstem includes the medulla, and this controls heartbeat and breathing, like I said, and the reticular formation, and this plays an important role in controlling arousal. So I'll click on these again so you can I'm not going to stay long on them, so you pause if you need to. This is the oldest part of the brain. And when we say the oldest part, that means that when you are forming in your mother's womb, the first part of your brain that develops is your brainstem. And the reticular formation, again, plays an important role in controlling arousal. It's a nerve network in the brainstem. And you can see all these things right here. The pons is just above the medulla, or no, I'm sorry, just above the medulla is the pons, and it helps coordinate movement. That's what the pons does. Atop the brainstem is the thalamus, and this is the brain's sensory switchboard. It's an incredibly important part of your brain. It's located on top of the brainstem again, and it directs messages to the sensory receiving areas in the cortex, and then it takes them and transmit replies to the cerebellum and the medulla. It receives information from all the senses except for smell. That's a big exception. Except for smell, and then it sends it to the higher brain regions. And it's going to deal with seeing, hearing, tasting, and touching. The cerebellum is often called the little brain, and it's attached to the rear of the brainstem. It coordinates voluntary movements with the help of the pons and balance, and it helps process sensory information. The cerebellum also enables one type of nonverbal learning and memory, and it helps us judge time, modulate our emotions, and discriminate sounds and textures. So the cerebellum is a very, very useful part of your brain. So, and let me say this before we move on. These older brain functions all occur without any conscious effort. So these parts of your brain that we just talked about, the brainstem, the medulla, the reticular formation, the thalamus, and the cerebellum, those 5 things, and the pons, I'm sorry, I left the pons out. So those 6 things, those all are functioning and occurring without any conscious effort. It's doing it on its own. This illustrates another one of the recurring things of psychology, which is our brain processes most information outside of our awareness. Our brain is doing things all the time, and we don't even realize that it's doing it. That's what's so awesome about our brain. We are aware of the results of our brain's labor, like our current visual experience, but, you know, when you see, you're not having to consciously think to yourself, okay, I need to process that and send it through my optic nerve, and my brain needs to send this electrical impulse, and so I can see this vision and this thing in front of me. You don't have to do that. Your brain does it for yourself. All you see is the image. So likewise, whether we're asleep or awake, our brainstem manages its life-sustaining functions, like breathing and our heartbeat. And so it frees our newer brain regions to think, talk, dream, or even, appreciate a memory, savor an experience, etc., etc. The limbic system has been linked primarily to memory, emotions, and drives. For example, one of its neural centers is called the hippocampus, and that processes memory. So if you have damage to your hippocampus, you're going to have memory damage or problems with your memory. It's a donut-shaped neural system, and we're going to do a really neat activity with a 3D brain simulation later so you can see this donut shape. And it includes the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the hypothalamus. And it's located below the cerebral hemispheres. It's associated with emotions and drives. The amygdala influences aggression and fear. And the hypothalamus is the third part of the limbic system, and it has been linked to various bodily maintenance functions and to pleasurable rewards. Its hormones influence the pituitary gland, so it provides a major link between the nervous and the endocrine systems. Your hypothalamus is incredibly important. So again, it's a neural structure lying below the thalamus, so and it directs several maintenance activities. If you have a overactive hypothalamus, then you might be hungry all the time, thirsty all the time. You might have a high body temperature. You might have a low body temperature. These things can be very bad for you, though. And it helps govern the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. Remember, the pituitary gland is the main gland of the endocrine system, and it's linked to emotion and reward. So the hypothalamus, your reward center in your brain, well, let's say this. Neural clusters in the hypothalamus influence hunger. They also can regulate thirst, body temperature, and sexual behavior. The hypothalamus both monitors blood chemistry, and it takes orders from other parts of the brain. For example, if you start thinking about sex in your brain's cerebral cortex, that's where you would be thinking about it, that can stimulate your hypothalamus to secrete hormones, and these hormones in turn trigger the adjacent pituitary gland, or the master endocrine gland, to influence hormones released by other glands. So again, you're going to see the interplay here between the nervous and the endocrine system. The brain influences the endocrine system, and which in turn is going to influence the brain. Two neuropsychologists from McGill University in the 1950s were trying to implant an electrode in a rat's reticular formation when they made a mistake, actually, but it was a good mistake. They incorrectly placed the electrode in what they later discovered was a region of the rat's hypothalamus. And the rat was behaving very curiously, and it kept returning to the location where it had been stimulated by this misplaced electrode. So what they ended up realizing was that they had stumbled upon a brain center that provides a pleasurable reward. So they did a series of very meticulous experiments, and they went on to locate other pleasure centers in the brain. So what the rats were actually experiencing, well, we don't really know what the rats were experiencing, obviously, because they can't talk. So rather than attribute human feelings to rats, today scientists refer to reward centers and not pleasure centers. So, but for example, when rats were being stimulated with this electrode in their pleasure center, what they would do, or reward center, they would press pedals. They were allowed to press pedals to trigger their own stimulations, and they would do so at a feverish pace, like up to 7,000 times per hour, until they absolutely dropped from exhaustion. So, and then to get more of this stimulation, they would even cross an electrified floor at a starving rat would not cross to reach food. So, I mean, these rats or mice were desperate to get to it. Some researchers believe that addictive disorders like alcohol dependence, drug abuse, and binge eating may stem from a reward deficiency syndrome. And they believe that that's a genetically disposed deficiency in the natural brain system for pleasure and well-being that leads people to crave whatever provides that missing pleasure or relieves negative feelings. So that's one of the various explanations for drug abuse and alcohol abuse, etc., etc. And the cerebral cortex is the last thing we're going to talk about before we end this video. The cerebral cortex is a thin surface layer of interconnected neural cells, and it's our body's ultimate control and information processing center. The cerebral cortex is, again, the ultimate control and information processing center. It's a very intricate, delicate fabric. The interconnecting neural cells are there. They cover the cerebral hemispheres, and it's a very important part. The cerebrum are the two large hemispheres that contribute 85% of the brain's weight. So when we're talking about the cerebrum, we're talking about, I'm sure when you think about a brain, it's what the cerebrum is what you're thinking about. This large area right here is the cerebrum. And it's almost like, think about the cerebral cortex almost like bark on a tree. The cerebral cortex is covering that cerebrum. It's the brain's thinking crown almost. As we move up the ladder of animal life, the cerebral cortex expands and tight genetic controls relax, and the organism's adaptability increases. So frogs and other amphibians with a small cortex operate extensively on pre-programmed genetic instructions, but larger cortex of mammals offers increased capacities for learning and thinking, and this enables us to be more adaptable. And what makes us distinctively human mostly arises from the complex functions of our cerebral cortex. So, glial cells support, nourish, and protect the nerve cells of the cerebral cortex. And again, they're also called glue cells. The frontal lobes are just behind the forehead, so right there, and they're involved in speaking, muscle movements, and planning and making judgments. The parietal lobes are at the top of the head and towards the rear, and they receive sensory input for touch and body position. So if you have damage to your parietal lobes, then that can really mess you up as far as knowing what your body is doing. The occipital lobes are in the back of the head, lower back portion of your skull, and they include your visual areas. So if you ever see somebody fall backwards, like their feet fly out from under them, and they fall backwards and hit the back of their head, that's why we say, did you see stars? Because they've just jarred their occipital lobe, and it messes with people's vision. So if you ever hit the back of your head, that's when you're going to, quote unquote, see stars. The temporal lobes are just above the ears, and they include your auditory areas. And so again, if you get hit in the side of the head and at a pretty strong force around your ears, then it can mess with your hearing. And each lobe performs many functions and interacts with other areas of the cortex. So please don't think that these are extensive, exhaustive lists. They're not at all. I mean, we know a lot about the brain, but we don't know nearly everything about the brain. The motor cortex is an arch-shaped region at the rear of the frontal lobes, and it controls voluntary muscle movements on the opposite side of the body. So, look at this right here. The left hemisphere section controls the body's right side when it comes to output. Body parts requiring the most precise control occupy the greatest amount of cortical space. So in an effort to find the source of motor control, researchers have recorded messages from brain areas involving planning, involving intention, leading to the testing of neural prosthetics for paralyzed patients. So that's a really, really, really cool concept. Mapping the motor cortex is something that they've been working on for years and years, and they're still working on it today. And they're trying to think about people who are paralyzed, and they're trying to help them be able to function again. The sensory cortex is a region at the front of the parietal lobes, and it registers and processes body sensations. And the most sensitive body parts require the largest amount of space in the sensory cortex. So input here from the sensory cortex, the left hemisphere section receives input from the body's right side. So when you feel something on your body's right side, your left hemisphere is processing that. And when your left hemisphere, or when you need your right hand to do something, your left hemisphere is telling you to do that. So here's another graphic to show you this. The association areas are not involved in primary motor or sensory functions. However, they integrate and act on information processed by sensory areas. They're involved in higher mental functions such as learning, remembering, thinking, and speaking. And association areas are found in all four lobes. Complex human abilities like memory and language result from the intricate coordination of many brain areas. So, again, association areas are areas of the cerebral cortex that are not involved in the primary motor or sensory functions, but they are involved in higher mental functions like learning, remembering, thinking, and speaking. This image right here is Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage is an incredibly neat story. He was a railroad worker in 1848. He was 25 years old, and he was packing gunpowder into a rock with a tamping iron. And a spark ignited this gunpowder, and it shot the rod up through his left cheek and out the top of his skull, which left his frontal lobes massively damaged. But to everyone's amazement, he was able to sit up and speak. And after the wound healed, he even returned to work. But unfortunately, Phineas Gage used to be a really affable, soft-spoken guy, and now he was irritable, he was profane, and he was dishonest. His mental abilities and memories were still intact, but his personality, however, was not. So he eventually lost his job and ended up earning his living as a fairground exhibit, which is kind of sad. But you know what researchers have done using measurements of his skull, which was actually kept as a medical record, and modern neuroimaging techniques, they've reconstructed the probable path of the rod through his brain, and that's what this is right here. So with his frontal lobes ruptured, his moral compass had completely disconnected from his behavior, and similar impairments to moral judgment have appeared in more recent studies of people with damaged frontal lobes. So not only may they become less inhibited without the frontal lobe brakes on their impulses, but their moral judgments seem unrestrained by normal emotions. So association areas, this is a good example of the association areas and what happens when they're damaged. So I meant to embed this in the PowerPoint, and I'm sorry I didn't. We're not going to talk about language right now. That's the next video. I'm going to go ahead and pull up this video for you to watch right now. This is a really good, if you've never seen the Vlogbrothers before, you should definitely check them out. But this is a really good video. As you can see, it's 3 minutes and 59 seconds long, so it's a really good video on Phineas Gage, and I want you to watch it, and then the video's done. So thanks, guys.
Good morning, John. I am a bit worn out on philosophical musings, and to tell you the truth, a bit worn out in general. So today, instead of thinking too much about things that people usually don't think very much about, I'm just going to tell you the fascinating tale of Phineas Gage. In 1848, Phineas Gage was a hard-working, well-liked construction foreman working on the railroad. He was helping to blow up the side of a mountain so that they could run a railroad through it, and this is something he'd been doing for quite a long time. What you do is you drill a hole into a rock, and then you put some blasting powder in there, and then you put some sand in there to pack it down, and then you pack it down with this rock. So Phineas was doing this, and then someone distracted him. I don't know what it was that distracted him. Maybe it was a raccoon, maybe it was a hot girl walking down the railway. But when Phineas came back to his work, he did not realize that he had not put the sand in, and so he shoved his little rod down the hole, creating a spark, and the blasting powder ignited, and his iron rod landed 80 feet away! Unfortunately, there was something in between that hole and whatever it was that was 80 feet away, and that thing was Phineas Gage's head. The rod went through about here, and came out like here. And now those of you who do not know the story are expecting the story to end, because where could the story go from there? Well, 3 minutes later, Phineas Gage regained consciousness, started talking to people, walked over to a cart, got in the cart, sat up for the 3/4-mile travel back to his house, waited there for a doctor, and then when the doctor finally got there, they chatted about it. The doctor took some wonderful written notes, which we have copies of, and I'm going to share some of that with you, though you may not want to listen if you're a little bit squeamish. The doctor wrote, "I did not believe Mr. Gage's statement at the time, but thought he was deceived. Mr. Gage persisted in saying that the rod went through his head." Mr. Gage got up and vomited. The effort of the vomiting pushed out about half a teacupful of grain, which fell onto the floor. The unit of measurement, teacupful, has since fallen out of use, but it's roughly way too much brain. And that same visit, Phineas said to the doctor that he hoped he wasn't much hurt. To which the doctor presumably replied, In the coming weeks, Gage would drop in and out of a coma caused by hemorrhaging in his brain. His family was assured that there was no possible way that he could live, which is also backed up by, reason. And they had his coffin and his burial clothes all ready, and then 2 months after the accident, Phineas Gage was walking around talking basically a normal guy. He wasn't quite normal. He wasn't quite the Phineas Gage that everyone had come to know and love, but on the whole, a lot healthier than you would expect from a guy who had lost several teacupfuls of grain. So because of his behavioral problems, Phineas Gage did lose his construction job. But P.T. Barnum, not to miss a weirdo, found this guy and his iron rod, and Phineas did a little tour of the circuses, earning some money that way. His psychological problems began to subside, he started holding down good jobs, and eventually he moved to Chile to become a long-distance stagecoach driver in a place where people didn't know that he was Phineas Gage. 12 years after the accident, late-onset epilepsy set in, which is very common in these kinds of injuries, and Phineas's health declined until he finally died. But the man had a 3.5-foot long rod of iron pass through his head at hundreds of miles per hour, and he was pretty much okay for 12 years. A final footnote to this bizarre tale: in 2009, a couple who loved to collect old photographs of people were scanning their collection and uploading it to the photo-sharing website Flickr. They uploaded a picture that they called the whaler, thinking that it was an injured whaler with his harpoon. Flickr quickly told them that there was no way that that big shaft of iron was any kind of harpoon, but not any suggestions about what else it could be until somebody commented saying, you know, you may have a picture of Phineas Gage there, and if you do, it's the only picture of Phineas Gage that exists. And that's one more reason why I love the internet, because it was the only picture of Phineas Gage. So John, behold, Phineas Gage, the only man to have ever had an iron rod pass through his skull at hundreds of miles per hour, and live to tell the tale. I'll see you on Wednesday.
So now I hope you're thoroughly disgusted. Have a good night. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Thanks, guys.